Hi, I'm Joan Cartan Hansen. Welcome to this Dialogue Web Extra. We're continuing our conversation about the world after bin Laden. We were talking about, in the live show, we finished up talking about are we safer now? Let me jump a little bit quickly into this topic. Should we pull out of Afghanistan? One of the reasons why we went into Afghanistan was to get bin Laden. We've accomplished that goal. Is it time to scale back in Afghanistan? And we'll start with you, Dr. Anderson in Pocatello.
Well, you know, some people have raised the possibility that if we withdraw, the Taliban could come back, take over, and then Al-Qaeda would be back in operation. I think in the preceding program, Dr. Smith and Dr. Raymond pointed out that, you know, Al-Qaeda's capacities to some degree has been degraded. Pakistan wants to control the situation in Afghanistan. The Taliban have always been a local movement. You know, they were allied with the Al-Qaeda, but the price of them having any share of power, you know, if we withdraw, is probably that they cannot be open allies with Al-Qaeda. And the shift in war on terror is that it would be better if we can actually shift the counterinsurgency to Afghan forces, you know, if that is possible. We could have Americans there as military advisors, you know, helping with intelligence, training, whatnot. But we probably can disengage, you know, more direct U.S. ground force engagement.
Dr. Smith in Moscow, what do you think? Is it time to start pulling troops out of Afghanistan?
A lot depends on whether you see bin Laden's death as related to Afghanistan. I mean, are we in Afghanistan now? I know why we went in back in the early part of the decade. Are we there now as part of the war on terror, or are we there now in order to accomplish some strategic goals? Are we a part of a war in Afghanistan? I think, you know, bin Laden's death has sort of conflated the two back to what it was when we originally went in, but I'm not sure that that's exactly what it is, why we're there now, if that makes sense.
It does. And what do you think?
One of the strategies that Al-Qaeda has talked about in the past was referred to as bleed to bankruptcy. Get the United States involved in various places, get the United States overcommitted, and then gradually see the United States weakened by trying to financially cover all of these costs. In fact, Al-Qaeda, with great relish, has pointed out that threatening to place explosives in printer cartridges costs very little, but the security measures that you have to come up with to deal with that are very expensive. So looking at the position in the United States today, we can't do everything. We're going to have to prioritize, and we can't be in Afghanistan forever. That doesn't mean I believe we should precipitously pull out.
Now, the president is planning to start withdrawing some troops starting in July. How do you gentlemen feel that is in that part of the world? Is it time to start pulling back?
Well, the vice president has always argued for reducing the footprint and relying more heavily on special operations and drones in a counter-terrorism policy as opposed to a counter-insurgency policy. And I'm sure his arguments have been bolstered by the success of this recent special operation.
Dr. Miller?
So part of this depends on whether you have a situation. The legacy throughout history has been that in that part of the world, you could wait the West out. It didn't matter what the West was. It could be Alexander the Great. You know, you wait long enough, they'll leave. It depends on what we leave behind in place as to whether these folks who we really dislike will come back or not. Because, you know, the argument for staying is maybe they're just waiting us out. But it seems that in this latest offensive and this latest push we had the last year and a half or so in Afghanistan, that we've made some real gains, and that perhaps leaving now won't be as bad a deal as it might have been before.
And Dr. Anderson?
Just a comment on what Dr. Raymond said before is that, Al-Qaeda's made some tactical errors. And, you know, the one thing he was saying about how they thought, you know, they'll draw us into these conflicts, they'll bleed us. Well, after, you know, we went into Iraq, then they defined Iraq as the theater of jihad, and then they said, you know, we should the jihadists should go there, fight the United States, wear us down there. And the insurgency there, I mean, they're still insurgents, you know, fighting in the name of Al-Qaeda, but that turned into something of a disaster, I believe, for them. And it actually ended up eating up, jihadists that could have been used in other fronts.
Yeah. If I might add one other thing, decision makers often go forward by looking in the rearview mirror. And Al-Qaeda, at least bin Laden himself, seemed to magnify the example of the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union was eventually pushed out of Afghanistan. And if the Soviet Union could be pushed out, then his assumption was the United States could as well. One of the problems, however, of trying to go forward by looking in the rearview mirror is that you don't recognize that things change. And the United States is not the Soviet Union. And for Al-Qaeda, I think that was a mistaken analogy.
Let me ask the three of you of your reaction when you heard bin Laden was dead. There was a big difference generationally about how people reacted, at least around the country. Did you see that on your campuses? And how did you personally feel about this?
I was, of course, surprised. It's been a decade, so I was quite surprised by that. And then I became glued to every source of news I could possibly get my hands on. The next day in class, I teach a course on American foreign policy, and the entire class was devoted to just an interesting, broad discussion of what did this mean and what are the implications. So I found the students very interested in all of this.
Dr. Anderson.
I was engaged in a telephone conversation, and then my brother interrupted it, and then he informed me that bin Laden was killed. And so then I told the other person, I have to cut off. I have to find out what's going on, because as the local terrorism expert, I was going to start being asked questions by our local media. But my surprise was that he was actually alive. I'd bought into the idea that he was on dialysis, and he's this person who was on the edge of death, and that he hadn't been seen for years, and perhaps he was already dead. So when I was surprised he was alive too, I was glad he was killed. Now, May 2nd, the day May 2nd, turned out to be the day that I was giving my final exam in my class in terrorism and political violence. And it's an evening class, a 2-hour exam, and I had like a 2-hour review period before that, where the students could bring up any terms, questions, concepts, and of course we devoted a good deal of that just to talk about what is the significance of the death of bin Laden. And so, but I think that the people who were above the age of adolescence at the time 9/11 took place probably were the people who reacted more, for them it brought closure. For the people for whom 9/11 was sort of a distant memory, it probably didn't make the same impression.
And Dr. Smith in Moscow.
Well, we're supposed to, as academics, be kind of dispassionate observers in a sense of these things, but I wasn't dispassionate really at all when the news came through. It was an emotional reaction, not an emotional celebratory reaction, but one where I identified with the folks I know who've been in battle, who knew folks in New York and D.C. and Pennsylvania in 9/11. That was an emotional reaction. As far as how things worked out in class, it was interesting not just to see here on campus, but to engage with the same students who I was in class with on 9/11 through Facebook and Twitter. To go right on there and engage with those same students and see how they were reacting to sort of bring that in a loop back to closure. That's something that we didn't have on 9/11 where we could turn to, and now you can be right back with those same students.
And how did those students react?
They're all over the world. Several of them are in the military, several are in D.C. in policy positions, several are in New York City. So they were engaged in different kinds of reactions depending on where they were. Some of them, took right to the streets, which wasn't something that happened really here in the Palouse, but was a big deal in Washington D.C. and in New York City, and seeing students turn to that was exciting.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time for this Web Extra and being on our broadcast show. If you want a chance to see the 30-minute broadcast show, you'll also find that at idahoptv.org on our Cove player, also on our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us for this Dialogue Web Extra.